They didn't just whisper it behind his back this time, they shut the doors in his face. Because right now, the story circling Prince Andrew is no longer just about scandal, no longer just about past mistakes or fading titles. It's about something far more humiliating, far more visible, and far more impossible to ignore. A royal figure, once welcomed everywhere, now reportedly being quietly, and sometimes not so quietly, blocked from stepping foot into the very local village events happening just minutes away from where he now lives. And if you think this is just gossip exaggerating reality, think again, because when a man who once walked into royal galas without invitation is suddenly seen as unwelcome at countryside gatherings, something deeper is happening beneath the surface. Something colder, something deliberate, something that feels less like coincidence and more like a coordinated social freeze-out that nobody is officially admitting to, but everyone is watching unfold in real time. Because here's where it gets uncomfortable. It didn't start with a public announcement, no formal statement, no dramatic declaration, nothing you could point to and say this is the moment everything changed. No, it started quietly, almost invisibly, with invitations that simply didn't arrive. Events that Andrew had attended for years, local fairs, charity auctions, seasonal gatherings, even those small countryside meetups where titles usually still carry weight, suddenly moved forward without him, and at first it looked like scheduling conflicts, harmless overlaps, nothing unusual, until it kept happening again and again until the pattern became impossible to ignore. And that's when people started asking the question nobody in royal circles wants to answer out loud: is Prince Andrew being deliberately kept out? Because sources close to the area, and by close, we mean the kind of people who see everything and say very little until it matters, have started describing a shift, not just in how Andrew is treated officially, but how he is perceived socially. And those two things, when they start aligning, that's when the real downfall begins. Because let's be honest, a royal title can survive scandal, it can survive criticism, it can even survive isolation behind palace walls. But what it cannot survive is quiet rejection by ordinary people, by neighbors, by the community that now surrounds you when the palaces are no longer yours to command. And this is where the story takes a sharper turn. Because Andrew isn't in London anymore, he isn't surrounded by controlled appearances and carefully managed optics. He's at Sandringham, in a rural setting where things move slower, where people notice everything, where word spreads not through press briefings but through conversations, glances, and the kind of silence that speaks louder than headlines. And according to what's being whispered, and whispered with increasing boldness, Andrew has reportedly attempted to attend at least one nearby gathering, only to realize in that quiet, uncomfortable way that doesn't need words that his presence was not exactly desired. No confrontation, no dramatic scene, just a shift in atmosphere, conversations pausing, invitations feeling conditional, eyes watching a little too closely, and then the realization that he wasn't being welcomed the way he once was. Now here's where things get even more complicated, because nothing about this situation is officially confirmed in the way traditional royal stories used to be, but everything about it feels consistent with a pattern that's been building for years: a gradual tightening, a slow distancing, a recalibration of who gets to stand where within the royal ecosystem. And Andrew seems to be drifting further and further outside of it, because let's connect the dots slowly, carefully, the way insiders are doing behind closed doors. First, the loss of official duties, then the stripping of titles and patronages, then the relocation, not just a change of address, but a change of status, from a grand residence to a farmhouse setting that, while historic, carries a very different kind of symbolism. Then the restrictions, the reported need for approvals, the limitations on movement, the controlled interactions, and now this, the social barrier, the unspoken line that says you can stay here, but you are not part of this anymore. And if you think that line doesn't matter, think again, because in royal life, access is everything. Access to events, access to people, access to visibility. Take that away, even quietly, even unofficially, and what you're left with is something that looks very different from power, something closer to isolation. And what makes this situation even more intense is the way it's unfolding in public perception, because the story isn't just about whether Andrew is attending events or not, it's about how people are reacting to the idea that he might not be welcome. And those reactions, they're not sympathetic, they're not divided, they're sharp. Because in the court of public opinion, which operates without rules, without procedures, without the presumption of innocence that exists in legal systems, Andrew's image has already taken a hit that's been years in the making. And now, every new development, every report, every whisper, every suggestion of exclusion isn't being questioned, it's being absorbed, reinforced, turned into part of a larger narrative that paints a very specific picture. A picture of a man man who once stood at the center of royal life, now standing just outside the gate, watching events happen without him. And that image, it sticks. It spreads. It becomes the story. But here's the part that people are only just beginning to notice. This isn't just about Andrew, because when someone at that level starts being distanced, not just institutionally, but socially, it sends a message not just to him, but to everyone connected to him, to the family, to the extended circle, to the people who have to decide quietly, carefully, how close they stand, how visible that closeness is, how much association they are willing to show in a moment when optics matter more than ever. And that's where things start to ripple out. Because absence from events isn't just absence. It's a signal that is read differently depending on who's watching. Some see accountability, some see punishment, some see strategy, and some see something else entirely, a slow, controlled disengagement designed to avoid a bigger, louder, more explosive break. Because let's be clear, in royal terms, nothing happens by accident. Not patterns like this, not repeated exclusions, not shifts that are subtle enough to avoid headlines, but consistent enough to be noticed. And that raises a question that hasn't been fully answered yet. Is this a temporary distancing or something more permanent? Is this about optics in a sensitive moment or a long-term repositioning that quietly redraws the boundaries of who belongs where? Because if it's the latter, then what we're watching right now isn't just a phase, it's a transition from relevance to something else, something quieter, something smaller. Something that doesn't involve standing at events, shaking hands, being seen. And if that transition continues, then the absence from village gatherings might just be the beginning. Because once you're no longer part of the small events, the local ones, the informal ones, the ones that don't make headlines, what happens when it's the bigger ones? What happens when the distance becomes more visible, more formal, more impossible to explain away? What happens when the line that is currently unspoken gets drawn more clearly? And maybe the most uncomfortable question of all, does Andrew see it happening? Or is he still holding on to the idea that this is temporary, that things will shift back, that the doors that seem closed right now might open again? Because history suggests something else. History suggests that once this kind of distancing begins, it rarely reverses. It deepens. It settles. It becomes the new normal. And if that's true, then the real story isn't just that Prince Andrew was reportedly banned from nearby village events. The real story is what that ban represents, what it signals, and where it leads next. Because once the doors start closing quietly, they don't suddenly swing open again with applause. They close tighter, heavier, more deliberately, until one day the silence around them feels permanent. And that is exactly where this story is heading now. Because what looked like a few missed invitations is beginning to feel like something structured, something controlled, something that insiders are starting to describe very carefully as a managed absence. Not a ban you can quote, not a rule written on paper, but a reality that everyone understands without needing it explained. And the more you look at it, the clearer it becomes. Because this isn't just about village events anymore, it's about presence. Who is seen, who is included, and more importantly, who is not. And right now, Andrew is falling into that last category because reports have started hinting at something even more telling. Not just that he isn't attending events, but that organizers are becoming increasingly cautious about even being associated with him. Think about that shift for a second. This isn't just social discomfort, this is reputational distancing. And it's happening at a level that feels almost instinctive, like a collective decision made without a meeting, without a vote, without a single announcement, just a shared understanding that inviting him comes with consequences nobody wants to deal with. Because in today's environment, perception isn't just important, it's everything. And Andrew's presence, it doesn't just bring attention, it brings questions. It brings headlines. It brings a kind of scrutiny that small local events are simply not equipped to handle. So what do? They step back. They create space. They avoid the risk. And just like that, the exclusion becomes self-sustaining. But here's where the situation starts to feel even more intense. Because according to what's being quietly discussed behind the scenes, Andrew himself is becoming increasingly aware of this shift, not through official conversations, not through direct statements, but through something far more uncomfortable, the absence of normality. Because when you've lived a life where doors always opened, where invitations were expected, where presence was assumed, the sudden lack of all of that doesn't need to be explained. You feel it in the empty calendar, in the lack of calls, in the subtle changes in how people interact with you when you do cross paths. And that feeling, it builds. Because every missed event isn't just a missed event. It's a reminder of where things used to be and where they are now. And according to whispers that are growing harder to ignore, that realization is starting to create tension, not just internally, but externally as well. Because there are suggestions, again, not confirmed, but repeated enough to be noticed, that Andrew has become increasingly frustrated with the situation, frustrated with the restrictions, frustrated with the isolation, frustrated with what he reportedly sees as an overcorrection that has gone too far. And that frustration, it doesn't exist in a vacuum, because when someone in his position begins to push back even slightly, it creates ripples that reach the people managing the situation, ripples that raise a new question. What happens if he stops cooperating with the quiet distancing? Because up until now, everything has worked precisely because it has been quiet, because it has been controlled. They start creating their own explanations, and those explanations, they don't always work in his favor, because silence can be interpreted in many ways, as strategy, as caution, as resignation, or as something else entirely, an acknowledgement that the situation is no longer within his control. And if that's the case, then what we're watching isn't just a social exclusion. It's a shift in power, a shift that moves quietly, steadily, without announcement, but changes everything. Being left out of a village gathering wasn't surprising anymore. It was expected. And once something like that becomes expected, it stops being a moment and becomes a condition that defines everything that follows. And if that condition holds, then what we're seeing right now isn't the lowest point. It's just another step in a story that still hasn't reached its final chapter.